Hello everyone, and welcome to Dutch Greybeard. The entire month of February and a bit of January and March, I read the 3 books that make up the first law by Joe Abercrombie. This chart shows you when I read which book and how long they kept me occupied. For this video, which is free of spoilers, I will briefly touch upon the first book and take a little more time for the other 2. This is because I already did a separate video on the first book, The Blade itself. If you want to hear me give a detailed and spoiler-free reading experience on this book, please check out this video. The link is in the description below. First Law was one of my most anticipated series to read since I started this journey into fantasy at the beginning of 2023. It is praised all over BookTube. The trilogy is on many top 10s or top 3s, and people can't get over how good these books are. Well, did it deliver on its promise, or am I going to be one of the few with an unpopular opinion? Let's find out. On January 29, I started reading The Blade itself, the first book in this extremely popular First Law series by Joe Abercrombie. I needed 16 days to get through the 515 pages, which in this case says something about my enjoyment of the novel. Several notes I wrote in the margins more or less sum up my biggest grievance. Story as of yet, unclear. I'm not interested in any of it yet. Still cannot get into this book. There is hardly any direction to the story. There are different storylines that follow characters like Logan Ninefingers, who comes into contact with Bayaz, the first of the mages, Sant Dan Glokta, Jezal Dan Luther, and Logan's buddies. These different POVs no doubt are related to one another, although the reader has no idea how. Also, their stories themselves don't seem to be going anywhere as well. Everyone's motive remains shrouded in mystery. This is somewhat of a letdown if you are a story-first reader like myself. That doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy it. All 3 books had a pick-up ability of over 80%, which is pretty high. Abercrombie is an extremely skilled writer. Within the world of the First Law, there seems to be no clear-cut division between good and evil. I find that refreshing. The Union, the North, and the Gurkish in the South represent completely different civilizations. One is not inherently better than the other, at least as far as I could tell from this first book. The characters are memorable and relatable, even though they are not likable in the least. All of the main characters are flawed. The one with the most depth to me is Sant Dan Glokta, who has a successful history as a hero warrior, but after 2 years of harsh torture is now reduced to a cripple who is in constant pain. His cynicism, nihilism, and dark wit are extremely well written down. He is the only character whose inner monologues we get to read. Most of the humor and irony is found in the dialogue, which is dark and witty at the same time. The banter adds some lightness onto the grim reality of the world the characters inhabit. All in all, my first acquaintance with this highly praised author was disappointing. I'm afraid there is no other word for it. The absence of an overlapping story is the main culprit here. I rated The Blade itself with 73 points out of 100, which is a 3.5 star in the upper regions. The extremely thin veils that were lifted from the overall story, like with the exciting visit to the mysterious House of the Maker, led me to believe that the next books might deliver on the promise of a true story. Let's see if that's the case. After the first book, I read the latest novel by Éowyn Ivey, Blackwood's Blue Sky. Then I continued with the second First Law book, Before They Are Hanged. Even though it is some 50 pages longer than the first book, it took me only 9 days to read. Let's not beat about the bush. To me, this book was more of the same. Like in the first book, the writing is superb. I very much enjoyed the dark humor, sharp wit, and unflinching realism. Great character work and crisp and authentic dialogue bursting at the seams with humor. But why do all the characters do what they do? What is their motivation, their goal, their ultimate wish? Again, every now and then we get a glimpse of what lies behind all of the fighting, the wars and questing of our antagonists. This is what I prefer to call the characters, because it is not quite clear whether they are pro or antagonist. This book gives me more to hold on to in terms of a story. There is a war brewing between two nations, a couple of characters are on a mysterious quest, another has to solve a murder and defend a city, and an army officer, one of the few characters that could be recognized as a protagonist, one of the good guys, goes to war under the command of a grossly incompetent leader. But that's the best sense I could make out of the many seemingly isolated scenes. And in the meantime, story-wise, things progress at a snail's pace. There are beautiful scenes, like a few moments between Logan Ninefingers and the extremely dark and aggressive Pharaoh. She upholds truths, such as helping people was always a mistake. Trust was a word for fools. It was a word people used when they meant to betray you. During their conversation, a small sliver of her bolster chips away, which is very craftily written. Glocta remains his nihilistic and cynical self. As for being a good man, that ship has sailed, and I wasn't even there to wave it off. When someone says that she would have thought his pain would give him empathy, he answers, "Empathy? What's that?" It's a sad fact, but pain only makes you sorry for yourself. Needless to say that the Glocta chapters were my favorite. There is also wisdom shining through all the grim darkness of the world in the characters. Fearlessness is a fool's boast. Words, my friends. There can be a greater power in words than in all the steel within the circle of the world. A minor thing is that a couple of times Logan's hand, the one missing a finger, is referred to as a three-fingered hand. Last time I checked, I had 5 fingers on each hand, and Logan is called Ninefingers. So, shouldn't it say a 4-fingered hand? I cannot imagine that this is an oversight of the author, so no doubt the thumb doesn't count as a finger. Still, it made me wonder. And then there is, of course, the abundance of battles and fighting, and killing and slaughtering. I've mentioned it earlier on this channel, it doesn't make for my favorite kind of reading. What doesn't really help in this respect is that the battles that are being fought seem so random and without any real stakes other than wanting to conquer land or a foe. The battles are no doubt well written, but I cannot summon up the effort to really try to understand how things exactly happen or how the two fighting parties are making headway or not. I've read it all, but at times I had to fight the impulse to skip pages and go to the end to see who had won. How that had happened was all the same to me. Before I reached the half point of this book, my hope to finally be let in on the bigger story had dwindled. That didn't help to keep my reading spirits up. I couldn't escape the sense that I was reading a book of short stories. There was not really a conclusion to the book at the final page. I liked Before They Are Hanged better than The Blade itself, because we get a little bit more of the story regarding the background of Bayaz, the first of the mages, the two worlds that are not allowed to interconnect, but for me it was not enough. I have laughed many times and was in awe of the author's skill in writing dialogue. I gave this book 79 points out of 100, which compares to 4 stars. Even though I didn't have much hope for Book 3 to suddenly lift all the mist that still hung before the story, I picked it up immediately after finishing Book 2. It took me about 10 days to read the 600 pages. Is Last Argument of Kings truly the culmination and explosive apotheosis so many book reviews promise? I'm afraid the answer to that question is no, it's not. At least, it was not for me. On page 239, I write in the margin, up until now, it again is more of the same. Nice, entertaining, even good at times, but Abercrombie will not become an automatic author for me. Certainly, the overall story finally becomes clear, but to be honest, it was not worth sitting in the waiting room for more than 1,500 pages. I'm trying to find a way to illustrate the two faces this book and trilogy have shown me. On the one hand, I enjoyed reading them. This final book even became a page-turner. But on the other hand, when things finally become clear, it remains underwhelming. When in the last 200 pages or so of Last Argument of Kings, the final epic battle ensues and we understand who the true antagonist is in the story, I wrote down in the margin on page 537, I am sorry to say that I hardly care anymore whether any apotheosis is still underway or what it is about. Also, hardly any of the developments and so-called reveals came to me as a surprise. I cannot give any examples without spoiling anything, but practically everything came to me like, oh yeah, I knew that. And on top of that, I find that the author finds it necessary to have some of his characters explain things when they really need no explaining whatsoever. So, there's positivity and disappointment. On the whole, it was a fun read, with all the dark banter and witty dialogue, like this conversation between Crummock and Dow. "D'you know what the moon said?" "That you're mad as fuck," growled Dow. Crummock slapped his huge thigh. "You've a pretty way of talking for an ugly man, Black Dow. But no, the moon said..." One of the sequences I enjoyed most is the ingenious way West forces two competing and bickering generals back in line. Again, for spoiler reasons, I cannot go into detail here, but those of you who have read this book will know what I'm talking about. It's a very strong piece of manipulation, which works remarkably well. This political play at its peak may even be my favorite scene of all 3 books. The Glocta chapters, as usual, are my favorite. After he has been attacked, he confronts his attacker. "Do you think the thought of a slap or two scares me? It hurts more when I piss. Do you think I'm scared to die? Every morning that I wake up alive is a disappointment." The closing lines of this chapter are Glocta's inner monologue. "And so it seems I survive. Again. Perhaps the trick is not wanting to." Glocta also delivers a good definition of what grimdark really is. "Truly, life is the misery we endure between disappointments. Every now and then I even caught a glimmer of wisdom. But you can't truly hate a man without loving him first, and there's always a trace of that love left over." The final pages were a huge anticlimax for me. Extremely unsatisfying to leave Logan Ninefingers, the character this trilogy started with, hanging on a proverbial cliff. And yes, I get it all. How the writer explores themes such as power and corruption, redemption and revenge, survival and sacrifice. But these are all themes that, in my honest opinion, merely scratch the surface of our human condition. Initially, I thought Last Argument of Kings would get the highest rating, but I gave the book 77 points out of 100. Perhaps one of the conclusions should be that I'm not really into grimdark, although I could argue the opposite as well. It is mainly that aspect of this trilogy I liked best, the dark wit, the bleak world with war, violence and suffering. They do not bother me in the least. The thing is, there is still so much fantasy for me to be read that it is not truly a loss that I will probably not be reading anything more by Joe Abercrombie, one of the most anticipated authors. George R.R. Martin is waiting for me, and so are Stephen Erickson, R.A. Salvatore, Jim Butcher, John Gwynne, Ken Liu, Mark Lawrence, Naomi Novik, Jen Williams, Tad Williams, Ryan Cahill, just to name a few. Upon opening this source of reading enjoyment at the beginning of 2023, this well has been overflowing and will not stop overflowing in the foreseeable future. So, I'm good, even though Abercrombie won't be an active part in the continuation of my journey anymore. I met him, and I enjoyed his writing. Now it's time to move on. Thank you very much for watching this video. Until we meet again, at Dutch Greybeard.